Good afternoon. Let's do some business. We are doing it live right here. Weekday afternoons at 4 o'clock. We get right down to business with the news-driven hour after Ben Shapiro and just before the 790 KBC News Blitz with Randy Wang at 5. Mottek On Money, live on the air. 790 KBC, streaming live online worldwide at kbc.com. And you're on demand. Mottek On Money podcast, kbc.com, Apple, iTunes, and all your favorite podcast platforms. Stocks closing mostly higher to wrap up the week with all three of the major averages seeing weekly gains. The Dow coming in for a closing gain of 125 points. The S&P 500 moved up 9, and the NASDAQ actually slipped a bit, just a fraction, to 16,340. NASDAQ actually down 5 points at the close. Investors taking in the latest reading on consumer confidence that came in disappointing, weaker than Wall Street expected. The Dow did see a weekly gain of 2.2%. That is the best weekly performance since December, so the best week of the year for the blue chip average. The S&P 500 moved up nearly 2% for the week. The NASDAQ saw a gain of 1.1%. Next week, we'll get a reading on inflation once again. The Consumer Price Index for the month of April will be coming out. We did see government bond yields finishing at their highest levels in a week amid signs of rising inflation expectations. The yield on the 10-year note is back to 4.50%. Oil prices posting modest moves for the week. We see, looks like gold actually slipped a bit today, down $1 to settle at $78.26 a barrel in New York amid rising tensions in the Middle East. And the latest readings on inventories, we saw the consumer confidence reading coming in disappointing. In fact, weak across the board. Consumers' assessment of the outlook for inflation deteriorated, while their view of buying conditions for homes, cars, and durable goods also worsened. I'll discuss the Main Street economy later this hour with a giant on the local business scene, Mark Wilbur, founding member and former chairman of the Los Angeles Business Federation, LA BizFed, and former associate dean of the USC Marshall School of Business. A new report finds the U.S. has been on the verge of a public safety crisis as along with an increasingly dysfunctional criminal justice system. I'll discuss that with the Honorable Dennis Zine, former LA City Council member, former LAPD sergeant, and current reserve LAPD officer with something like 56 years of service to the City of Angels. More dramatic videos of crimes happening here in the Los Angeles area. We'll be bringing in Dennis Zine live later this hour. But first, on your money, the markets, and the economy. Joining us live now, Axel Merk, President and Chief Investment Officer at Merk Investments, which includes the Van Eck Gold Trust, the Van Eck Merk Gold Trust, and he's also the author of Sustainable Wealth. Axel Merk, thank you very much for joining us live here this afternoon. Quite a week with the Milken Institute Global Conference this week. We heard from a lot of Fed officials, and I understand you too have been attending some pretty high-level conferences this week. Give us your view of things here at the moment.
Yeah, happy Friday, Frank. It's been an extraordinary week. On the talk, one thing that in our internal discussions we commented on, it's not as heated a discussion. After all, Fed officials and also other former Fed officials, they are in part academics, and so they take things in stride. It's different from when the Fed was very much behind the curve and people were just screaming, why on earth are you not acting? Whereas now it's more of an academic talk. Now, that said, part of the reason is because nobody quite knows what to do next, and that includes notably also the Fed officials. They would have loved to cut rates, but the economy is holding up better than expected. Now, clearly, we had one point at least this week with the initial jobless claims being a bit stronger than expected. And sure enough, that allowed some people to say the recession is coming sooner rather than later. But of course, for the academics at the Fed and economists, one data point doesn't make it quite yet.
All right, we saw the former California gubernatorial Republican candidate Neel Kashkari, who now is the president of the Minneapolis Fed, commenting this week, saying the Fed may need to hold rates steady all year, maybe even a bump higher, possibly. There's still a discussion about that. Neel Kashkari speaking this week at this big conference here. What is your outlook for where rates go from here?
Yeah, so Kashkari, of course, has been a bit all over the place and sometimes makes the headlines. As you mentioned, I attended at the Hoover Institution a conference, and Fed President Goolsbee talked there. And one thing he said is that maybe people should be talking less. There's just so much noise out there. And that's kind of my view. One of the challenges, and I think I've mentioned this on your program, is that ever since the financial crisis, because the Federal Reserve is so involved in the markets, they have taken away many gauges that the Fed would historically look at. And so as a result, they have to read the tea leaves based on past economic data. And it's, of course, very difficult to be proactive when you have to look rearview mirror all the time. And so they're just taking things in strides, right? If the economy is going to weaken and inflation is going to come down, then they'll cut rates. And so I'm not telling anybody anything they don't know. I think what Fed Chair Powell has made clear is that he has a clear bias towards easing. And so that, of course, goes against what Kashkari just says. But at this time, still, Fed Chair Powell is calling the shots. So more attention is being given to when he speaks. And then there are obviously some other Fed speakers like New York Fed President Williams. I understand he also spoke at the Milken Institute. When he speaks, then markets listen because they just have more influence. And at least those folks are very confident that we are in a tightening bias at the Fed, and so at the quote-unquote worst, they have to wait. But if the economy weakens, things then they can go lower. Now, my view matters less because I don't call the shots. My own view is that this economy is weakening indeed, and that historically anyway, the Fed always cuts more than is priced into the market. But sure enough, this is the most forecast recession ever, and obviously the Fed hasn't cut rates, and it's of course possible that this rate cut is going to be elusive for several more months.
On the Air Live with Axel Merck. And Axel, you of course track gold very closely. Looks like gold had an up day and an up week, it seems here. What about gold here in the face of these inflation concerns ongoing?
Yeah, so the bias that the Federal Reserve has towards easing is helping the price of gold, and the price of gold has performed very nicely, given that long-term rates in particular have moved higher. Remember, this gold that doesn't itself pay any yield is competing with whether you have a real return on cash, including longer-term cash, meaning bonds, and those who buy gold must believe that because of maybe deficits, because of maybe future rate cuts, that the purchasing power of the currency, the US dollar, may not be as strong in the future as it is now. And then, of course, the other big buyer in gold have been foreign central banks, the Chinese and Chinese consumers as well, that for maybe the Chinese consumer because they don't trust their own currency or government, and the Chinese government because they don't like to keep all the money in treasuries. They have been motivated to diversify. Generally speaking, when the Fed is in an easing cycle, that tends to be a positive for gold. That said, of course, the price of gold has moved quite a bit higher already, even though we are in a quote-unquote easing cycle, but we haven't had any rate cuts yet, of course.
On there live with Axel Merck. And let me ask you this, Axel, as far as the consumer confidence reading we got, not a big surprise as we've seen in the past when gas prices go up, consumer confidence goes down, and of course with all the nervousness in the Middle East, we have seen a recent spike in gas and oil prices, and looks like oil's starting to level off here a bit, but that's obviously an important component of consumer confidence, consumer sentiment, and inflation. What's your outlook on that front?
Well, we saw recently that when the escalation in the Middle East did not happen, meaning when Israel and Iran were at the brink of potentially having inflaming or igniting a bigger conflict, when it didn't happen, there was some reprieve there. I recently talked to somebody who says all of this is a tempest in a teapot because this region is small. I don't quite agree with that assessment. That said, what that person also argued is that ultimately the Arabs want to do business with Chinese as well, and so they're going to keep things in check. I'm not so sure whether you can control all these things. I am personally concerned about escalation in that area. I think that more broadly speaking, the long peaceful period we had since World War II is relatively speaking anyway, is coming to an end, and conflicts like we have in Gaza and Ukraine are going to become more frequent. If that is correct, then of course, price of oil and the like might continue to be elevated. We, of course, also have the deglobalization trend, which we just had tariffs being raised here on electric vehicles from China. And so all that is somewhat inflationary because the reshoring means a higher cost of doing business than when you were able to put production in the most cost-effective place in the world.
All right. In the meantime, stocks rising. The Dow just below its all-time high. We had quite a winning streak here. That proverbial wall of worry seems to be climbing again. What does the stock market see that a lot of us are not seeing?
Well, historically, the stock market does well when there's an economic expansion. In shallow recessions, the stock market can do well. It's doing more severe downturns that the stock market performs poorly, and we haven't had a recession. Now, that said, I don't like the valuations, but again, it doesn't matter what I like. It matters what the market embraces. And one of the things that is not happening, despite this allegedly tight environment, is credit spread. So the cost of doing business for the not so creditworthy hasn't spiked. And so we have this environment that continues to be quite favorable. Part of it may be that, as you may remember, and many of your viewers remember, the listeners remember, we do have some issues in the commercial real estate market. And so the Federal Reserve cannot afford to use their sledgehammer too aggressively. A side effect of that is, though, that the sort of adjustment process that would normally happen in a tight environment is being, at the very least, slowed down significantly. So it's this odd environment in which we're evolving. I happen to think that ultimately we have a tight environment, and at some point that will hit home. And when it does, there's not going to be a significant warning sign ahead of time. And then the Federal Reserve will scramble to cut rates more aggressively.
On the live with Axel Merck, and you're also a currency expert. We did see jobless claims, that number you mentioned, weighing on the dollar and boosting gold this week. Dollar strength has been in the news, and people getting ready for their summer vacations, paying more attention to the currency exchange rate. What's your outlook here for the dollar and anything catching your attention in the currency markets at the moment?
Well, the European Central Bank published its minutes earlier today and didn't move the markets all that much. I think everybody kind of expects the European Central Bank to start lowering rates sooner than the Fed will, with less of progress on inflation, I would allege, at least in some areas. And some other central banks are holding tight. But still, the world has somewhat shifted, looking more towards an easing bias. We, of course, also have Japan, where the yen had been under pressure. In all these countries, the U.S., Europe, Japan, part of the challenge is that the fundamentals don't look so great. Obviously, the Japanese have way too much debt. The Europeans have way too rigid an economy, and in the U.S., we've learned to be able to spend money like there's no tomorrow. So it's in that sort of environment, it's kind of you pick your evil. A lot of people argue that the U.S. has had the cleanest of the dirty shirts. I'm not so sure whether that's the way I like to look at these things. But I think that we should keep an eye in particular on the yen, whether the speculators will pick a fight with the Bank of Japan. And by the way, I do think central banks have only limited power if the market turns against them.
You just remind me, I forgot to pick up my dry cleaning today, so thank you for that important reminder. And let me ask you this, Axel, the dollar being where it's at this point, are you placing any bets at this point in the currency markets? Is the dollar still poised for strength here, or given the debt situation that everybody's concerned about, but nobody seems to be doing anything about? What is your outlook on the dollar here?
On the business side, we don't do too much currency, quote-unquote, speculation these days. We used to be very active in the market. On the personal side, I do take my time shifting money around if and when I do need it internationally. That said, I do think that the dollar has good potential to weaken further from here. There's a lot of upward momentum that has taken place, in part because of that delay in cutting rates. I do think that at some point this economy will weaken more in earnest, and then the U.S. dollar will be more vulnerable which, by the way, then in return of helps the price of gold as well, should that materialize.
All right, Axel. Anything else on your radar screen? What do you think? What kind of reading will we get next week on inflation? Do you think it'll be coming in hotter than expected? And what kind of market reaction might we see?
Well, currently, based on what my Bloomberg screen says in front of me, the year-over-year expectations for the CPI are 3.4% year-over-year. That's down from 3.5%. As a reminder, that's above the 2% target, but somehow that is a victory for the Fed. And I think that's kind of the theme here, that inflation is somewhat stubbornly high. And at these conferences, we were at that part of the talk was also, well, should the inflation target be changed and whatnot? And officially, it shouldn't be, but tacitly, maybe it is. The CPI indicator that consumers focus on, the consumer price index, is not the primary one that the Federal Reserve is watching, but it is an important reference point. And should it be higher than expected, it will push those rate cut expectations further out. I happen to think a lot of that is noise. We know that the Fed is not going to do much unless there's going to be a significant change, notably on the downside. If we had a much lower inflation reading, the rate cut might come earlier, but ultimately what they really want to see is that the economy weakens in this, and so then they have an excuse to cut. And it looks like, based on Powell's communication, that even if we have 3.5% or so CPI reading, that he is not opposed to lowering rates because he appears to be sufficiently comfortable with that. Keep in mind, by the way, that as inflation comes down, the real interest rate moves higher when interest rates stay steady. And so I've argued for a while that a cut in rates, the Federal Reserve will communicate as not really cutting rates because real interest rates have gone up, and therefore they're just adjusting things, and they'll continue to have a tight environment.
Axel Merck, thank you very much for coming to the line on this big week and setting the stage for the week ahead. Axel Merck, President and Chief Investment Officer at Merck Investments, which includes the Van Eck Merck Gold Trust ETF, also author of Sustainable Wealth. Axel, it's always great to have you with us. Thank you very much for taking the call here this afternoon.
My pleasure.
And right out to the freeways we go now on 790 KBC. 790 KBC welcomes Howard Jones and ABC with Haircut 100 to the YouTube Theater coming up on August 20th. Live Nation's Concert Week is here with $25 tickets to more than 5,000 shows. Tickets are on sale now through May 14th at Ticketmaster.com. Right now, caller 9 wins. Call 1-888-790-5222. You can get a pair of tickets to the show if you're caller 9. Call right now, 1-888-790-5222. Mottek On Money continues here in 790 KBC. Mixed finish to the week on Wall Street, a winning week in which we saw the Dow gain 125 points today at 39,513. The Dow racking up pretty decent gains this week. In fact, scoring its best week since December, the best week of the year for the blue chip index. The S&P 500 ticked up 9 points to settle at 5,223. The NASDAQ ended lower by 5 points at 16,341. The yield in the 10-year note is back up to 4.50%. Checking the cryptos now, Bitcoin up 140 at 60,766, Ethereum up 10 at 2,899, and Doge at 14 cents. Gold moving higher today to $2,375 an ounce. Silver slipped slightly to $28.27 an ounce. Platinum ticking higher to $997.40, and palladium now at $977.75 an ounce. And now the latest news for you here on 790 KABC. Mottek On Money continues here in 790 KABC. A new report out showing the U.S. has been on the verge of a public safety crisis and an increasingly dysfunctional criminal justice system. Crime's been rising in the U.S. and is worse than statisticians have claimed, even though preliminary reports from the FBI had shown crime decreasing in the last few years. Researchers in this latest report say crime is down is like descending from a tall peak and standing on a high bluff, saying you are closer to the ground, a true but misleading statement. Of course, the crime wave continues here in the Los Angeles area. Let's bring in the Honorable Dennis Zine now, former Los Angeles City Council member, former Los Angeles Police Department Sergeant, and current LAPD Reserve Officer with about 56 years of service to the City of Angels. Dennis Zine is on the line. Dennis Zine, thank you for the call here, and give us your reaction to this latest report and give us the real on what's happening out there.
What's really happening out there, Frank, is crime is continuing. Our district attorney, George Gascon, is not doing his job of prosecuting the criminal element that is committing crimes. We've got an increase in crime. You have to watch the news, listen to the radio, and it's continuing. The Metro situation, the smash and grab situation, it just continues, and it's not stopping. And we find these criminals continue to commit crimes, repeat the crimes, and there's not enough police officers, for one. Number two, there's not enough dispatchers to dispatch the 911 calls. And number three, you have a criminal justice system that is letting these people go because we don't have prosecution that needs to be aggressive and incarcerate these people and retrain these people to be productive citizens instead of being criminals. We have a lot of unreported crimes. A lot of people say, well, nothing's going to happen. Every time you don't report a crime, that doesn't help the system. You need to report every single crime. I have a friend that was at a mall recently, parked her car, went in, did some shopping, came back, broke in her car, and stole everything that was inside the car. What should I do? You need to make a report. Well, how do I make a report? Go to the police station. She went to the police station. Then they said, go home and do it on the computer. The problem is we have a real broken system when it comes to crime reporting and investigations because of lack of personnel. So you put this all together, you got an unsafe environment that we have here in Southern California, in particular, the city of Los Angeles.
All right. Even this latest report noted businesses and individuals have appeared to show a reluctance to report criminal activity, leading to many unreported numbers. Many business owners harbor the belief that the police will not respond in a prompt fashion if called to investigate a crime. I also have heard anecdotally that some businesses don't even want to report it because their insurance rates will go up.
That's correct. And it's true. We don't have enough police officers. It's very true. Recruitment is not doing very well. The numbers keep shrinking, many people retiring, and we find once they retire, they leave California and go to other neighboring states which are safer, and the taxes aren't as great. As we know, the governor's releasing this budget that shows a huge deficit. The city's got a huge deficit. So people find California they're going to have a better lifestyle. But the fact of the matter is you need to report it. You can report it online. In fact, they encourage you to report it online. We used to have police stations open 24 hours a day. Many stations now close at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, don't open until the next morning because they don't have enough personnel. So there's a desperate need for personnel, and that's why many people are out buying guns and getting a concealed weapon permit so they can carry it, so they can provide protection for themselves. The system is really not there doing what it needs to do to protect life and property, at least here in the city of the Angels. And I want to comment, there was a county supervisor recently talking about Metro, and this county supervisor said she is afraid. She's afraid to ride the Metro system, the bus system that we have in Los Angeles. I mean, that's how sad it is when an elected official comes out publicly and says, afraid to ride it. That is not a very good message. And again, you've got the situation at schools where now they want to bring back the school police, that they disbanded the school police for the most part. You can't play ping pong back and forth. You're either going to have aggressive enforcement, do the job in a professional manner, or you're going to let crime run crazy, as we see happening here in Los Angeles.
Is the pendulum going to swing the other way? We heard a big endorsement for Nathan Hochman, the veteran prosecutor who will be running against the current DA, George Gascon, in the November election. How would you size up that race at this point?
Well, I hope that Nathan wins. I'm supporting him. And I'm saying anyone except George Gascon. It's down to these two candidates. We had a number of candidates in the primary, and it's down to these two. And if people are inclined to vote for George Gascon to keep him in office for another 4 years, all you're doing is asking for more crime, more victims, and more consequences of a system that's failing. We know he's not doing his job. We know 98% of his deputy district attorneys have voted against him as a leader. He's got a big indictment going against one of his key personnel who's doing illegal activities. I mean, it's a joke what we have this district attorney. And if people want to vote for him, all you're doing is voting for more crime, more violence, and you put yourself and your family and your neighbors at risk when you vote for Gascon. I don't want to be all political, but the bottom line is it's public safety more than political. Public safety needs to come first. You need a prosecutor who prosecutes. Gascon is not doing the job.
On the line with Dennis Zine, and of course these encampments at the universities getting a lot of attention, still set up in some places, by the way. We've seen these horrific anti-Semitic incidents and students going to and from class have to endure all of this. A lot of focus of attention now following what happened at UCLA and that big incident there involving the campus police and later the LAPD. What's your reaction to all of these latest incidents and what might happen this weekend?
Well, what I've learned from a lot of people who are knowledgeable about the situation, they're not all students. There are some people who are being paid by individuals to go out there and cause disruption. They're not all students. And with graduation taking place, those students that are graduating will leave the campus, will remain quiet for the most part. But there are professional agitators that are going out there and causing this situation. Yes, there's some students, but the main thrust is from these people who are not students, and they're simply there trying to cause disruption and chaos on the campuses. And I want to emphasize that LAPD goes in with mutual aid along with the sheriffs and the highway patrol. We saw what happened at UCLA and SC. Law enforcement needs to protect people, but school administration needs to maintain security on the campuses. And once you start setting up a tent, that's when they come in and take them down. Don't let them set up. Don't let them live there for a couple of days in the tent. You cannot set up a tent, period. As soon as it's established, you take it down, you remove it. Nip it when it happens, and don't just wait and let it fester. I've seen happen, and then you have outbursts of violence.
Of course, speaking of tents, just driving around even on Hollywood Boulevard, just outside the Walk of Fame, wherever all the tourists in the world flock to, you see those tents set up there, destroying businesses all along Hollywood Boulevard. You were on the city council for many years. How do you think that situation should be addressed with these ongoing encampments, just generally the homeless encampments impacting businesses out there?
Well, they're negatively impacting businesses, and it's a real shame that Los Angeles is to that point. When I was in council, it wasn't to the degree it is now. It's just gotten worse, and hopefully the court will come back with a decision saying that it can be removed, and once that takes place, I think there'll be a very aggressive effort, especially with our mayor, to get rid of those camps throughout the Hollywood Boulevard, Sunset Boulevard. You got nice areas that have been infiltrated by the homeless population. I empathize the homeless, but we don't have to surrender our streets and our sidewalks to the homeless population and destroy businesses and destroy the quality of life in the communities of Los Angeles City. You don't see too many of those in Beverly Hills. You don't see too many of those in a lot of other cities in Ventura County, but you see them smashed all over Los Angeles City, and that's a real shame to see that happen.
Don't see it at all in Beverly Hills, because I understand there the homeless have a choice of either to accept help, move on, or get picked up, and they do not tolerate tents and so forth or encampments in front of businesses there. So there is certainly a big difference in the way things are handled there. And Dennis, I know you've been involved in traffic enforcement for many years. We're seeing all kinds of nutty, unbelievable situations out there with that race car that took off and somebody was killed this week, and then near the Century City Mall just yesterday we had another situation, a police chase. What's your reaction to all these crazy things happening on our streets?
Well, one thing that's happening is you don't find a very aggressive traffic enforcement effort in the city of Los Angeles. They have fewer motorcycle officers, fewer officers doing enforcement, and you find the situation getting worse when people commit violations that are very, very dangerous. We see what's happening on Pacific Coast Highway. Now the city of Malibu has contracted with the Highway Patrol to do more aggressive enforcement. They're writing a lot of citations out there. But people need to understand, and I see it all over the time, all over the place, people speeding, reckless driving, going through red lights. I was driving down the street this afternoon. A car goes right through a red light right in front of me as I'm going down the road. And if I wasn't alert, I may have hit the car. And they were totally, completely in the wrong. But we have negligence on the roadway. We don't really have enough police presence and enforcement to take that effort. And I was a motorcycle supervisor. I know what it is when you have aggressive enforcement. There's consequences. People are not complying with traffic laws, and the consequences are crashes, injuries, and deaths.
On the line with Dennis Zine, the Honorable Dennis Zine, former L.A. City Council member, former LAPD Sergeant, current Reserve Officer. Thank you very much, Dennis Zine, for coming to the line.
Thank you, Frank, and have a good weekend.
You too. Thank you very much. Stay safe. And right out to the freeways we go right now on 790 KABC. Folks, people like you and me have our ear to the ground on all things business. We like to be informed and indeed well prepared. As important as finance is, I want you to have a plan in case you're hit by someone not paying attention to the road. Thinking ahead serves us well, and even still, we can get caught off guard as people are so focused on their destination that they might not have a plan if they're in an accident that's not their fault. That's why I encourage you to put my friend Attorney Clark Fielding's number in your phone. That number is 833-88-SHARK. So if you're in an accident, you'll be ready with your strategy to make Clark Fielding your very first call. Fielding Law aims for the highest possible settlements, considering you might need long-term care, rehab, compensation for lost wages, and any ongoing physical or emotional pain. So if you're hurt in any kind of accident, call for a free consultation with Fielding Law. You can trust them. They're honest, respected, and your strategy in case you get into that unexpected accident. Motorcycle, truck, pedestrian, scooter, hit and run, boating or bike accidents, you name it. The number to call, 833-88-SHARK. That's 833-88-SHARK, or go to ClarkTheSharkLaw.com. Mottek On Money continues here in 790 KBC. The financial market's been rallying lately, but nervous time on Main Street with the consumer's assessment of the outlook for inflation deteriorated. The latest reading on consumer confidence coming in below analyst expectations today as inflation remains hot. We'll be getting a new reading on inflation next week. Let's talk about the Main Street economy now with Mark Wilbur, founding member and former chairman of the Los Angeles Business Federation, LA BizFed, former associate dean of the USC Marshall School of Business, Fight On, and current chairman of Employers Group. Mark Wilbur, great to have you with us here this afternoon.
Great to be here, Frank. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks very much. What is the buzz among the business folks out there on the inflation front and the overall economy, for that matter?
That's funny. I don't know if you saw it or not, but because it literally just came out a few hours ago. But the Nielsen's IQ 2024 Consumer Outlook, boy, it just was a download of, for the data nerds out there, you kind of can't help yourself but to dive in, because that's all Nielsen does, right? So anyway. They were looking at data from 2019 to now. It's kind of hard because, when you take a look at 2020, 2021, where you got COVID in there, it really throws some things off in good and bad directions. But when you compare it to 2019, you compare it to today, you really have some pretty solid pillar in 2019. So since 2019, the fast-moving consumer goods, the necessities, these are the things like toiletries and the basics of everyday living, cereals and that kind of thing, up 31%, Frank, from 2019. I mean, that's staggering when you think about that. The election occurred in 2020, and I was hearing the other day Biden was saying that he inherited a 9% inflation rate. That is completely not true. I don't know where he got that number or why they even had him say it, because he inherited a 1.4% inflation rate. It was, completely flatlined and not a problem. And so, now we're battling with this inflation. But I just thought it was very interesting, Frank, when you take a step back and you take a look at inflation, you take a look at the cost of housing, the rise in that over the last few years, and these interest rates that are just the death nail on top of all of it. That's just killing businesses and consumers. And then you have another thing that people don't think about. The one thing that's really brutal about inflation is that wages never keep up with the pace of inflation. So, you're up 31%, you're not going to have a wage increase of 31%. So it's actually kind of a secondary hit on the head, in the sense that, you've got inflation climbing, but your wage is not going up at the same pace. And so you can't even keep up. And so that's why you see all these stories about people dipping into their retirement, taking on further credit card debt, all these kinds of things. So all these things together are really going to start, it's going to continue the pinch on consumers. So I know that was a very long-winded answer, but I just wanted to kind of talk about that. And the last thing I'll mention, Mark Zandi, the Moody's analytics chief, who I really respect, and brilliant guy, they do a little different analysis on it. So in just the last 3 years, Americans are spending for the same items in that grocery cart $1,069 more a month, which is, that's at $13,000 additional on top of people. I think this is why you've seen a lot of strikes by unions. I think this is why you see a lot of, reactions. And this is why, it's created such a complication with the minimum wage increase in the fast food industry, because it's just adding, fire on top of an already inferno situation. So, it's really difficult. So sorry for the long-winded answer, Frank, but, I can't help myself late on a Friday.
That's right. We are on the air with Mark Wilbur. We appreciate that thorough assessment of things, and that's also probably a big reason why we're seeing consumer confidence slipping as gas prices move up. We see consumer confidence move down, and a lot of nervousness about the inflation number that's coming out next week. And of course, you cover the labor market very closely. You have pretty much a front row seat of what's happening on the job front here. But certainly the consumer experience in supermarkets. You go in there, there's maybe one person at the checkout stand, and then you're on your own. You end up working for the supermarket there, and then their employees direct you to these self-checkout things, and you have to put in the numbers, and then they're training you how to do their jobs, right?
Right, exactly, but you don't get a paycheck at the end of it.
No, you don't. That's right. So
that's so true, Frank. So, I'll tell you one other thing that just kind of struck me. I love politicians because, they kind of, they make things up, or they cut things that don't actually exist. So, I love Cal Matters. I don't know if you spend any time there, but I think you do actually. They really do a good job of digesting a lot of things in the California marketplace. And they were talking about the $27.6 billion shortfall we are currently wrestling with in our state. And so the governor today steps forward, or maybe it's yesterday, and he's going to cut 10,000 jobs to try and help with this, jobs that are vacant currently. So he's counting jobs that don't actually have bodies in them. So, and I understand, it's like future jobs. So we're cutting future jobs, but that's how government accounting works. So I think this is why, if they ever wonder why most people don't really understand our government and how it all works together, this is like one of those moments that leaves people scratching their heads, but that's how it works. He's going to cut jobs that that are in the budget, but, don't even have a body in them right now. So it's not actually cutting from a current payroll situation like, they're forcing a lot of employers to do.
Pretty amazing. And then you got those robotic couriers out there. It's amazing what businesses are doing to try to trim costs nowadays, cutting staff. Actually, at the Milken Conference, get a load of this, I was served an ice latte by a robot that completely was a robotic barista. So that was quite an experience. So we'll probably see more of that. And then, of course, we have the driverless cars out there, too, now.
Yeah, well, when you and I were talking, back in when that whole bill on the fast food increase on wage came up for the $20 increase, what was fascinating about that, if you remember our discussion, we literally called on air that all this is going to do is force robotic investment because you're not going to be able to afford a bunch of employees at $20 an hour.
That's right, and we'll be facing those iPads more often, just about everywhere. Mark, always great to speak with you. Look forward to our next conversation live on the air. That's Mark Wilbur, founding member and former chair of the LA Business Federation, former associate dean of the USC Marshall School of Business, and current chair of Employers Group based here in Los Angeles. Live with us here, Mottek On Money on 790 KBC. Stay tuned now for the 790 KBC News Blitz with Randy Wang, and I'll be back with more at 4 on Mottek On Money, 790 KBC.
Afford Anything talks about how to avoid common pitfalls, how to refine your mental models, and how to think about how to think.
Paula, while certainly you can mess up on $1 million a year, it is far less likely than it is on $30,000 a year.
Right.
I would meet wonderful people that were struggling with a budget that was super tight. It was 100%. You need to make more money.
Make smarter choices and build a better life.
Afford Anything, wherever you listen.